Hi, everyone. I'm Naomi Clark, and to my left is Merritt Kopas, and to my right is Austin Walker. And as I just mentioned, we are, in fact, three human beings. And we're here to have a conversation about Twine. And so to get started, I'm just curious, because I think the answer would have been pretty different a few years ago. Raise your hands if you have heard of the game development tool Twine. Nice, so it's like most of the people in the audience. Okay, now raise your hands if you yourself have made a game using Twine. I see a lot of hands too. Yeah, you can raise your hands. Yes, that's cool. Me too. Yeah, so the change in the number of people raising their hands, which I'm guessing is a lot more this year than it would have been 2 or 3 years ago, is a big part of why we're here on the stage. As is that second question of people making games with this incredibly accessible tool. So to get started, I just actually want to ask my co-panelists to introduce themselves. And maybe I'll start, right? So I'm Naomi Clark. I'm an independent game designer, writer, and teacher here in New York City. And I first discovered Twine around in 2012 when I noticed some really interesting voices appearing and making a kind of game that, to me, was sort of pushing the boundaries of what a game could be. And I experimented with myself, and I recently embarked with Mary Flanagan and her Tilt Factor lab up at Dartmouth on a multi-year project to investigate how we could use Twine in an academic context to give students tools to talk about and educate each other about challenges they're facing as women and minorities in STEM fields. And so we're investigating how Twine could be used not just as a way of deploying a game to an audience, but as a way of letting people make games and communicate with each other, share experiences, and sort of produce new forms of knowledge. So that's where I'll leave it myself. So Merritt, tell us about yourself and what you've been doing with Twine.
Hi, so my name is Merritt Kopas. I'm an artist and game developer out of Toronto. And I guess, yeah, I've been working with Twine since about 2012 too, and I think maybe we'll come back to that as like this moment when things sort of first started erupting. But I've made, a little over a dozen games in Twine at this point, and they range from very simulationist adaptations of board games to kind of like interactive poetry. So there's like a wide range of form that I think is really interesting that we could talk about later. And most recently, I was the editor on this book, Video Games for Humans, which is a Twine anthology. Thank you. Also, Naomi and Austin are in this book, so please also applaud for them. And that was really exciting. It's sort of the first time that we've collected Twine work and sort of said that it's worthy of being looked at by folks outside of these communities, which is a really exciting thing, I think. So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
Hey, I'm Austin Walker. The first time that I found out about Twine was in that same window in 2012, and I spent a lot of time as just a player and someone who was watching from the outside, not only the games, but a lot of the conversation that was happening because of Twine, about defining some of the borders of games and stuff like that. But I didn't actually step into game making until last winter when I made my first Twine game, which is a game called A Century, which is sort of a cyberpunk short story. And since then, I've begun using Twine not only to make games, but to organize my thoughts around other game projects that I'm making that aren't necessarily even in Twine. And I think that is one of the strengths of the tool. I'm also, as Merritt said, in Video Games for Humans. I write my playthrough of a game called There Ought to Be a Word by the fantastic Jeremy Penner. It's really great. You should support Merritt and pick up that book.
Great. So I have some questions for you guys to sort of kick off this conversation. So when we think about Twine in the context of games that are designed to have an impact, we're usually talking about games that are made by an individual creator. And when we think about the effect that they have on people, we use words like that they're very expressive, they're moving, and they have a personal touch. Right? That's a little bit different than the kind of messages or impact that might be constructed in an institutional setting. So I'm curious whether about your own works or other Twine games that people you know or have worked with have made, How have you seen or heard about games made in Twine affecting or moving people?
So for me, I think that there is sort of a boilerplate answer that we hear a lot about Twine, which is that like, oh, these are marginalized voices. These are stories that you don't hear often in the space of games, and you know that's great because it brings in players to these stories that they wouldn't have heard otherwise. It offers the suggestion that maybe games can be for more than just blowing up things and shooting aliens, which is great. But I also think when we talk about the impact of Twine, you have to take into account the impact it's had on Twine developers and not just people who consume Twine games. Specifically for me, the kind of most revelatory experience with Twine was understanding that now I had this new mode of expression available to me that I had thought was closed off to me because I'd bounced off of so many other game-making tools. And seeing that realization for me is you know, that for me is the biggest impact. When I get a direct message from someone who's played my game and they say, hey, how hard was it for you to do that? I really want to make this weird little thing. I want to make you know, a kind of a journal memoir game about losing my brother. Or I want to make a weird like choose your own adventure wrestling simulation. And both of those experiences are very valid. And for me, the impact isn't just, oh, people will get to go play those games about this emotional moment or about this ridiculous, like, you know, pile driver wrestling move, but also that those creators can now explore this mode of creativity that they thought was just not available to them at all.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to echo a lot of that. I think one of the biggest things that Twine has done is create this demonstration effect where, yeah, people see work being created and then think that that's something that they can do. And I think that this really brings us beyond, like, the ways that we normally talk about representation around games are like, oh, I can see a woman character, or like you can see like a black character or whatever. And like that is important and that matters, but like, you know, it's another thing to see someone like you doing the kinds of work that you want to be doing. And so, yeah, I think Twine, one of the most exciting things about it is the way that it's sort of blurred that consumer-producer dichotomy a little bit and sort of opened up more exchange between those positions and like sort of created a more permeable boundary.
Right, and the term empathy games sometimes gets used when talking about Twine, right? Like as if that's the most important impact that we could be talking about, that as a player, you're being put into the shoes of a character who maybe represents the creator, maybe it's drawn from the autobiographical experiences of that person. But there's something that seems kind of limiting about that, right? That the idea that that someone is just shooting their own experiences out at an audience that has completely different experiences in order to sort of try and cultivate something. Yeah, so I think a lot about, yeah, the effect that you're talking about of demonstrating that it's possible, and then also to facilitate communication between people who actually have similar experiences that we might take for granted from outside, that, oh, well, you know, there must be a community of these people all talking to each other, knowing each other already. But really, that's so often not the case, especially in the modern world or communities that are really spread out geographically. So I wonder, you guys have seen a lot of new voices come into game creation through Twine. And do you feel like that's something that's happening? Are people actually being connected to other people of like experiences, so that it's not empathy for the different, but maybe actually connection to shared experience?
Yeah, no, I think definitely that's happening. I think there is this thing that happens where the mainstream will pick up on a kind of work that's being created. And then I think that's where that term empathy games comes from, is that people assume that this work is being created for them because everything is, so why wouldn't, you know, this be? When really, yeah, so much of this work, getting back to the early stuff that was sort of cropping up in 2012 around like what people were talking about as queer games, was created for people, like as a way of people finding each other, I think. And then of course people are gonna try and interpret it as being for them, but ultimately I think a lot of that work has created communities, and like in this book, a lot of the people who are critiquing and like reading the work are members of the same community. And there are sort of like, even if it's not like a cohesive group, there are these networks that have built up around the tool, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. I certainly would not have been able to involve myself with the tool or ever use it without the work of some people in the space who have contributed, you know, tutorials and guides and you know, templates that I could use to work with. I think that's true for most people coming into the space, and it is that's part of why I think it's easy to talk about it as an accessible tool. Though I have, I think, similar concerns about the rhetoric around accessibility that you mentioned, with concerns about empathy, which is to say, like, of course there are games that produce in the player the effect of empathy, and that is great. But there is something lost in the reduction of all of the games in this space, or even the ones that do that have that effect, to think of them only as quote unquote empathy games. Not to like harp on that. I don't want to just make this like where I talk shit about people who've called them empathy games. It's not what I want to do. However much I secretly do want to do that. But I think that there is, at the end of the day, for me, this whole conversation ends up being about whether or not we talk about the medium, or the multiple ways we can talk about the medium and the tool, kind of orbit around the question of self-care versus kind of community building or world changing. And obviously those are analytic categories. There's a blurring between all of them. But when we talk about community building, a lot of that for me has always come about because I feel the need to like throw my elbows around and make some space for people who are like me, who want to feel safe in this space. And I think Twine has been, and the communities have grown up around Twine, even though they're growing up around technical reasons, end up creating a space where like, oh, okay, like this is a space where I can make this game that does not fit in anywhere else in the game space, or that I don't think does anyway,
Yeah, so let's talk about that question of accessibility a little bit, because that's a word that gets associated with Twine a lot. Like that's what is maybe most commonly seen as its revolutionary potential for games. That it's a tool that you maybe imagine like, you could just drop it like a seed into a community or give it to a bunch of students, and it's easy enough to use. You don't need any programming skills. You can start writing a hypertext story or an interactive fiction or a branching narrative by connecting different nodes of the experience and giving players choices or sometimes lack of choices to connect those things. And that's what a Twine game, we can think of it as being made of. But how real is that idea that it's super accessible? Can you just hand it to someone and say, go, make a game? Or what kind of skills are actually important to have in order to get started? What kind of things do say, a student or a novice creator need in order to not just start using a tool, but also understand how they could make something that's good, that's expressive, that gets at why we like Twine games?
Well, I think Austin's got a lot to say about this, but I just want to bring up one thing real quick, which is the overwhelming majority of Twine games are written in English. If you can't read English, you don't have access to that community, and like we don't talk about that a lot because like the games community is overwhelmingly Anglo-centric, and like that's one of those things that we just don't talk about. And I think Rami Ismail has done some really great work around that with Game Dev World, which I think there's a booth out in the hall of just talking about broadening that kind of access around language. But that's something that we definitely need to work on around that. But I'll let Austin say more.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to say, first of all, like I completely agree with you that for me has been one of the things that I think we forget about is the Anglocentrism. But I do want to start by saying that for me, yeah, of course, Twine was very accessible. I bounced off of so many other tools before that. I didn't make so many games that I had like a bare bones design for because I couldn't figure out how to do it, and I got really frustrated, and like I'm like a weird anxious academic, and so frustration is this really terrible thing for me because it means that my entire self-worth is meaningless. I'm okay, I promise. So there is that level of accessibility, and there are moments when I want to defend that accessibility. A few weeks ago, I had a friend, actually this was a couple of months ago now, time is very difficult, like I said, I'm a very anxious academic, who I was asking Twitter, like, oh, can I do this thing or that thing in Twine 2.0, which had kind of recently released, and one of my friends who was not involved with this community at all was like, I've never heard of Twine, what is this thing? And looked at it and then came back and said like, hey, why don't you just use HTML to do this? If you want to make hypertext stories, just use HTML. And I said, like, no, like that's not, there are things about Twine that are, for me, more approachable. But as always, whenever I realize that I'm saying like, oh, this is good because it's good for me, I always have to take that step back and say like, well, what are the conditions in which I've been pushed through to make this tool good for me? And are those conditions available for other people? And what are the conditions of reception for people who judge this game or that game as being good? And so I think a lot about the access that I had to educational systems that taught me the skills of prose writing. And that's not to say that there isn't a limited, no, it is. I'm going to say that inside of the field of Twine, there are standards of what good prose looks like. And it's experimental and it's interesting, but just as in the last 2 decades, we've seen an explosion of, say, the urban fantasy genre, which targets a readership that did not grasp and love the conditions and the conventions of traditional fantasy writing. And here I'm talking about books that are coming out of impoverished communities, black communities, brown communities, writing for audiences that are black and brown and poor. I hope that we'll see that same turn in Twine over the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully sooner than that even. Because right now, the space, there are people of color in the space. I'm in this space. Rochelle is in the space. But the stories that are being told here in that space are informed by a historically white sense of what good writing looks like. And we live in a world in which good writing is hard to learn, quote unquote good writing. And so for me, those are the things that we don't ever address when we talk about, is this thing an accessible tool? We don't talk about the difficulty it is to not only learn how to write in a way that will be received well, but to be confident in your own ability to write prose. I think that the thing that we mean when we say Twine is accessible, when I say it, is I'm not a math guy and Twine is accessible to me, right? Like, programming hurts my feelings, so Twine is accessible to me. I'm a visual learner, so being able to lay out with the tool of Twine, like all of these different things, that's accessible to me. And it turns out that again and again and again, we just put an ellipses at the front, and we just say Twine is accessible, and that's it. And being more critical about what that accessibility comes from, for me, is one of the steps that we need to take to continue its spread and its use to new audiences and to new sorts of creators.
Yeah, so that puts me in mind of an interesting example. I often give Twine to sort of introductory game design and development students to get them thinking about choices or lack of choices, and to do game writing. To sort of construct some simple systems and to get their hands dirty with actually making something. And one thing I found really interesting is that I do have a lot of black and brown students who don't come from backgrounds where they've had a lot of English composition practice. And one game that I found really interesting that a student of mine made was a Twine simulation of a Dragon Ball Z episode, essentially.
I'm so into this. This is the
you're
best.
really excited, right, Austin?
Yeah, I'm so hyped.
And it was very, very minimal in terms of writing, and it had a lot of pictures that were screen grabs from different episodes of Dragon Ball, right? And it was like, okay, here's what's going on, and are you gonna shoot a giant ball of energy at someone, or
Yes.
are you gonna jump 1,000 feet in the air?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I was like, this is so different from the idea out there of what a Twine game is. It's still potentially really meaningful for a student to say okay, this is, I'm going to make this thing. I'm going to, and the story ended up actually diverging from Dragon Ball Z, right? There was some additional kind of fanfic-like creativity, but
This is the best story.
Yeah, but so that game doesn't have this, wouldn't enter into the community of people currently making Twine, or the press that's excited right now about, the expressive power of Twine for marginalized communities, in part because there's this giant gulf between games that we think of as being artistic and expressive, and then this sort of low culture of cartoons and and say other types of video games, right? And what do you guys think the future is going to look like if, as Austin is saying, we're able to get Twine into more hands? Is there going to be a split? Is there high Twine and low Twine?
Actually, just in the last few months, I've seen Twine sort of leak out of the original spaces that it was really taken up by in 2012 and 2013. And it's sort of leaking into some spaces on Tumblr that I'm a part of. And so people have been making I've seen Twine games in the last few months about like furry fandoms, about like 90s anime. So like that is actually I think starting to happen. Is I think there is this like trickling out and like the spreading of this tool, and like it's sort of linking like other communities, which is really exciting to me because like my whole thing is this is a really accessible tool and like it doesn't need to be used by people who want to be quote unquote game designers. And so having it move into these like other fan spaces where there is like more diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and stuff, I think is super cool. And I'm hoping that we can like loop some of that stuff back into games and sort of like have those works be held up in these spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it might not be like the frontal assault on accessibility or on diversity that we kind of talk about in our bunkers, like how we can make these spaces more diverse. But you know, lots of young black dudes love Dragon Ball Z. Speaking as one, and if I could have thought, you know, so when I was 15 and I was in high school, I absolutely had the Dragon Ball Z tabletop role-playing game, which you could use the action figures for as you little. Okay, it was the best. And that game was actually written in part by Mike Pondsmith, who made the Cyberpunk series, who is a black game designer, which I didn't know at the time, but looking back, I'm like, oh, that's okay, yeah, cool. And that experience for me was one of the first things that got me into tabletop role-playing games, and my fandom brought me into this space where suddenly I was tinkering with rules, I was trying to make a game. And so even though it's kind of this like, you know, you're going around to get to your solution, you're kind of circumnavigating the question of diversity and entering those spaces through kind of diverse fandoms. That's the sort of thing that like makes young black and brown men and women like realize, oh, right, I can make games. And something, Naomi, that you kind of touched on was that these games can be, even in Twine, system-based. It doesn't only have to be a game about kind of emotive personal writing. It really can be something that is about variables, you know, relating to each other and systems being tracked, which is a thing that we also just don't talk about too often with Twine games.
Yeah, and if I can just riff on that for a second, I think one thing that we need to keep in mind, like as people who are interested in like pressing for a wider range of representation or like more marginalized voices in games, then we have to be conscious of the fact that like those voices aren't always going to look the way that we expect or even want them to if we're honest with ourselves, right? Like, I think when it comes to like women making games or people of color making games through Twine or through whatever tool, like we have to be open to the possibility that like those are the people who dictate what their games get to look like. We don't get to say like, oh, this isn't what we want a game to look like, so it doesn't really count, and we're just going to hold up this one person who is doing what we expect a video game to be like. Like that stuff is like, it counts, right? And that's stuff actually being done by real people. So we have to be open to the fact that things are going to look different.
Well, and for me, that hang up of like, this isn't what I want it to look like, comes for me so much from the position that like, oh, well, a game is for a consumer to have. Whereas, one of the things that I love about Twine is like, no, a game is a thing for a developer or for a designer to make first and foremost. And you know, that's a completely, I will not stand by that position. If you come to me later, like maybe I'll switch places. But I do want, for this moment, to strategically emphasize that aspect of Twine. Because we speak a lot about accessibility of the consumer. And I'm happy that we do that. You know, a few minutes ago, Meg was up here talking about 80 days, and one of the best things about it was I could give my mom 80 days. She hasn't played a game in 20 years. She would be able to play 80 days because she likes reading fiction, right? Like that's she has the skill set ready for that, and that's a big problem with games. But for the degree that I think that Twine can make impacts, the thing that I would love us to leave this room thinking about is I could hopefully give this tool to a person who has never made a game before, and as long as I'm clear with them about what they can do, as long as the templates and the tutorials aren't only saying like, all right, and then you write your flowery prose, like that's what you do. As long as it's clear that we've developed a kind of a catalog of games that are acceptable and that we say these are good examples and they're diverse and different and they do different things with this tool, I think that will encourage that to happen with new voices. You know.
Yeah, it might be worth mentioning at this point that the student assignment that I was just talking about that led to the Dragon Ball game was actually an assignment to create a system simulation. And it turns out that in my experience as a teacher teaching game design, it's one of the easiest tools to get started with if you're going to make a simulation of the kind that we see a ton of in Games for Change. And I've had students create simulations of immigration systems, of farming and crop rotations, things drawn from their own personal experiences but also that are fairly system heavy. So it's kind of great that Twine is flexible that way. So I want to ask change the direction of the conversation a little bit and talk about the participation of organizations and institutions in these communities using Twine as a tool. Because so far we've been really talking about the individual voices of creators, getting more people into the space, but there are also some interesting examples cropping up out there of organizations, nonprofits, creating games with Twine because it's so accessible. There's a pro-choice organization in Texas released a game, Choice Texas, that maybe some of you are familiar with. And they don't look exactly the same way as the sort of more raw, prose-centric, expressive personal Twine games that are out there. But it's a type of use of this tool that I think is particularly relevant to Games for Change. Do you guys see potential there for organizations, especially smaller organizations that might not have the budget to hire a developer that's making a game from scratch in C++ to use Twine? Is that going to have an impact on how individuals are using it? Is there anything that we should be careful of or excited about in that realm? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, one example that jumps to mind, although it was made by a design group, was Antidote Games made a game called Accused, which is about false confessions and like police interrogations with Twine. That was really great. And I think, yeah, when we're talking about like small organizations, I think the real attraction of Twine there is the ability to make a work, and maybe having a designer on as like a consultant or something. Like I think there's still a role for designers in like talking about how to like describe systems and things, but I think there's the possibility to sort of move away from this model of a designer coming in and making work for an organization or for a community and sort of putting the tool into the hands of the people who are actually doing the work. And I think that gets to something that was mentioned in the last talk, which is just the idea of making games with people rather than for them. Getting away from that kind of like almost colonialist mindset of like, we're gonna do this for you and like we're gonna make things better for you rather than working with a community. So that's exciting to me.
Yeah, definitely. I know a few months ago, an organization that I'm familiar with, Dames Making Games, held an event outside of Boston for, I don't remember what the museum was. I think it was a museum for women, like women's history or something. And most of the attendees to that event were women, were elderly women, women over 60. And the final day of that event was a Twine game jam for these women to learn that tool. Soha ran it. And was apparently very successful. Like a bunch of people who had never, at the beginning of the week, had ever thought about making a game, had suddenly picked it up. And obviously, I don't think that these people are all going to go home and like continue this practice, but I think that experience is valuable in and of itself, in the same way that like going to your yearly poetry workshop is valuable in and of itself. Going to an event that is about learning to paint with watercolors. I have experiences in my life where I went and dabbled in a thing, and that sort of dabbling is valuable. It does not need to be reduced to what new thing comes onto the market from that creative output. The creative output is the change I'm looking for in some real ways, especially creative output that doesn't get reduced to market value. Pursuing that and learning how to pursue that in new ways, and maybe teaching a handful of new people how to do that, has value both rhetorically and politically right now.
Right, and also in terms of creating a community of practice, even if it's a temporary one, right? I think that's really interesting in the context of organizations too, to think about who's holding various types of knowledge. So in social justice-oriented nonprofits, sometimes we talk about who's holding all the financial knowledge of an organization and how is that concentrated, as opposed to maybe being spread out so more people can actually participate in decision-making. And I think that it could be true here of games too, traditionally seen as a more arcane field, but with something like Twine, you could see like, oh, actually maybe more people in the organization can actually participate in creating the work like Merritt's talking about.
There is a Canadian political economist named Harold Innis who has this notion of the monopoly of knowledge, our access to technologies. Let us have access to new modes of thinking. The medieval priest could write, and that transformed the sorts of arguments the medieval priests could make that the common peasant in the medieval era could make, right? They don't have access to that same sort of thinking. Ideally, and this is the thing that is attractive about the argument about accessibility, making games as a mode of thinking it's a mode of thinking through problems, it's a mode of thinking through representations. And being able to offer that new mode of thinking breaks up that monopoly of knowledge, and that's part of why Twine is so attractive to me.
Okay, great, and I think we're out of time, so I think that's a great note to end it on. Let's stop being gatekeepers of game creation. The end. Thanks.
Thanks.